They were the faces that captivated the world, the voices that made millions fall in love. But what if I told you the real story was never in the music? Behind the velvet curtains, away from the flashing cameras and screaming crowds, there was another stage, one built on secrets, power, and survival. Rick James, Luther Vandross, Marvin Gaye, legends who gave the world timeless melodies but carried untold truths that fame could never silence. Today we pull back the curtain on the side of R&B that no one dared to speak about, the packs, the pain, and the price of immortality. Before entering these surprising stories, hit that subscribe button, turn on the bell, and join us as we uncover what really happened behind the spotlight. 1. Luther Vandross. Luther Vandross was a man draped in elegance and contradiction, a soul who turned pain into melody and silence into power. His music was velvet, smooth, romantic, timeless. Yet behind the orchestras and candlelight, there was a man who guarded his truth more fiercely than his fame. For decades, fans adored him, critics praised him, and the world believed it knew him. But those who stood behind the curtains whispered a different story, one written in quiet deals, coded language, and rooms where cameras were never allowed. Before Luther's voice became the soundtrack of love across America, he was just another struggling dreamer in the Bronx, shy, sensitive, and desperate to rise above the noise. His father's death when he was only 8 left a hollow space that music alone could fill. By his 20s, he had become a background vocalist for legends like David Bowie, Roberta Flack, and Bette Midler. But raw talent, especially for a young black artist in the 1970s, rarely guaranteed entry into the world of the elite. Connections were currency, and charm could be as valuable as talent. It was in those hidden spaces, the after-hours lounges, private mansions, and exclusive dinners, that the first rumors began. They called them arrangements, a word that sounded polite enough to disguise its meaning. Within the industry, everyone knew what it implied. Luther's company was desired, and his presence came at a price. Wealthy producers, men of power and influence, invited him not to sing but simply to be there, elegant, attentive, radiant. A sound engineer who once toured with him recalled, he walked into every private event like it was Carnegie Hall, pressed suit, polished shoes, a gentle smile. He treated even the smallest moments like performances. There was no arrogance in him, only composure, the poise of a man who had learned that survival often depends on silence, and that silence became his armor. He never confirmed the whispers, never denied them. To the press, his personal life was off limits. No scandals, no lovers, no gossip columns. The more he withheld, the larger his mystery grew. The absence of confession became the essence of his legend. Luther wasn't just a singer, he was a sanctuary for emotions too complicated to name. Perhaps that's why his love songs cut so deep. When he sang "A House Is Not a Home," it wasn't just heartbreak you heard, it was loneliness. When he whispered "never too much," joy trembled with ache, like a man celebrating love he could never claim. A critic once wrote, "Luther sang as if love was something sacred, hidden, and forbidden." And maybe it was. Maybe his greatest muse was the love he couldn't live openly, only expressed through song. Through the 1980s and 1990s, Luther ascended to the heights of fame, sold-out concerts, platinum records, Grammy Awards. Yet the rumors never fully vanished. They simply became background noise to a voice too divine to question. The industry knew the truth, or at least fragments of it, that success sometimes required compromises no one dared to admit. Luther just carried his with more grace than most. He once said in an interview, "Music is my life. Everything else is just scenery." And perhaps that was his quiet confession, a reminder that art was both his refuge and disguise. In 2003, a devastating stroke silenced that golden voice. 2 years later, at 54, Luther Vandross passed away without ever revealing the private chapters of his story. The world mourned the singer, but few realized the man had already lived several lives. the dreamer, the companion, the survivor, and finally the legend. Maybe he understood that truth isn't always meant to be spoken. Sometimes it's better sung, softly, beautifully, hidden beneath strings and melody. Luther Vandross proved that you could walk through shadows with elegance, love without permission, and leave behind a legacy that makes the world weep, even when it never truly knew who you were. 2. Johnny Gill. Johnny Gill was never just the new guy in New Edition. From the moment he joined the group in 1987, his deep, velvety voice and commanding stage presence elevated him from backup singer to the beating heart of the band. He brought maturity, romance, and vocal control that stunned audiences and redefined the group's sound. But while the spotlight focused on his musical precision, few saw the rumors swirling quietly behind him, stories of calculated relationships and private appearances that had little to do with music and everything to do with survival. Born in Washington, D.C. in 1966, Johnny grew up in a devout, church-going household, performing gospel music alongside his brothers from a young age. His voice was his ticket out of poverty, and it didn't take long for industry insiders to recognize his potential. By 16, he had released his first solo album. But even with early success, the competition was ruthless, and opportunities often came laced with expectations that weren't always spelled out in contracts. By the time he joined New Edition, Johnny was polished beyond his years, elegant, soft-spoken, and always perfectly dressed. Yet sources close to the industry began whispering about his off-stage life. Multiple accounts suggest that during slow periods in his early solo career, Johnny was invited to high-end private events hosted by older, affluent men, some connected to entertainment, others simply rich and curious. He was allegedly compensated to attend, to charm, and to accompany these individuals, with boundaries left deliberately ambiguous. If fame knocks but demands your silence and your body first, is it still a dream, or just another transaction in disguise? One associate from the New Edition crew recalled a period in the late '80s when Johnny frequently attended exclusive gatherings, never photographed, never publicized. He wasn't set there as a performer, the source said. He was there as someone Sepp's guest, and not just for dinner. These appearances weren't always overtly inappropriate. They were discreet, paid, and veiled under the term companionship, a word that in certain circles said everything without saying too much. Johnny, to his credit, has never addressed the rumors. He has consistently maintained an air of calm and class, brushing off inquiries into his private life with a smile and a redirect. Even when tabloids speculated about his close relationship with actor Eddie Murphy, Johnny offered no explanations, saying simply that people will believe what they want. That silence only fueled more curiosity. But fans noticed something deeper. Johnny's ballads, like My, and There You Go, weren't just technically perfect, they were intimate in a way that felt almost too real. His delivery carried the weight of lived experience. It wasn't just romance, it was longing wrapped in restraint, a love that felt expensive, dangerous, or maybe even secret. As Johnny's solo career continued to thrive in the 1990s and 2000s, he expanded into business, acting and producing, always retaining his polished image. But for some fans and observers, the gap between the public Johnny and the rumored private history added an unspoken depth to his performances. That tension between public control and private complexity gave him an almost mythic allure. Even today, Johnny remains one of the few artists of his generation to preserve mystique in an era of oversharing. If the stories of his early career contain truth, they're not evidence of scandal but of sacrifice, the story of a young man navigating an industry built on closed doors, leveraging every ounce of charm, beauty, and grace to earn a space at the table. He never asked for pity, he simply sang. And in those smooth, deliberate notes, some listeners heard more than love. They heard the echo of compromises never spoken aloud. 3. Rick James. Before he was the leather-clad super freak commanding the funk universe, Rick James was just James Ambrose Johnson Jr., a runaway from Buffalo with a turbulent past and big dreams. Born in 1948, Rick was raised by a single mother after his abusive father abandoned the family. His teenage years were marked by rebellion, military desertion, and constant brushes with the law. But behind the glam and gold teeth of his later fame was a younger Rick who had to learn fast how to survive in a system that wasn't built for black ambition. After fleeing to Toronto in the 1960s to avoid the Vietnam War draft, Rick immersed himself in music, but fame didn't arrive overnight. While still an unknown talent, he floated through nightclubs, jam sessions, and upscale parties, places where his magnetic personality was often worth more than his music. Multiple insiders from the era have described a recurring pattern, Rick being invited not just to perform, but to stay longer with wealthy party hosts, some of whom had no interest in funk at all. These encounters weren't framed as gigs, but as arrangements, nights where charm, allure, and availability were exchanged for cash, favors, or introductions to industry insiders. It was an unspoken economy, where access to powerful people often meant surrendering parts of oneself that had nothing to do with talent. Rick played the game, but on his terms. Have you ever wondered how many stars had to sell more than just their art before the world listened? Unlike others who kept these experiences buried, Rick embraced the chaos of his past. In interviews, he dropped cryptic references. "If you're in the game, you play the game. I played it better than most." His brashness wasn't just ego, it was armor forged from years of compromise. At elite parties in Beverly Hills, insiders recall Rick arriving with his guitar and leaving with stuffed pockets. One session, musicians said, Rick wasn't just performing music, he was selling a vibe and experience, and people paid for it. But that path left its scars. Fame eventually came in the late 70s and early 80s with hits like Give It To Me Baby and Mary Jane. Rick's on-stage persona, hypersexual, defiant, dripping in confidence, wasn't an invention, it was an extension of who he had to be to survive in an industry where a black man's talent was often exploited while his personal worth was negotiated in backrooms. As success grew, so did the darkness. Rick's well-documented drug use, particularly cocaine, spiraled out of control. Legal troubles mounted. Behind the outrageous antics was a man wrestling with a life built on blurred boundaries between performance and reality, survival and consent. One particularly haunting chapter came later in his life when Rick was convicted of imprisoning and abusing a woman during a drug binge. He served over 2 years in prison, a painful, ugly fall from grace that forced even his most loyal fans to re-examine the myth. Yet what made Rick James endure wasn't his controversy. It was his raw truth. His music pulsated with lived experience, whether it was pleasure, pain, or power dynamics. Even at his most outrageous, you could feel the residue of the nights he never spoke about, the ones where he didn't just sing for an audience, but stayed behind after the lights dimmed because someone paid him to. In the end, Rick James wasn't just a provocateur, he was a mirror reflecting an industry that chewed up its creators and asked them to smile while bleeding. His survival tactics, flamboyant, defiant, and sometimes destructive, were the tools of a man who learned early that charm could be currency and sex appeal a bargaining chip. Rick passed away in 2004 at age 56 from pulmonary and cardiac failure, his body weakened by years of drug abuse. But the legacy he left behind, the grooves, the hits, the legend, was shaped as much by what he gave away in private as what he unleashed on stage. 4. Billy Paul. Before me and Mrs. Jones turned him into an international name, Billy Paul was already living a life that blurred the line between music and mystery. His voice, smooth, aching, and deeply human, carried the weight of someone who had seen too much of the world before the spotlight ever found him. There was always something in his eyes, a flicker of knowledge unspoken, as if he understood that behind every dream lay a quiet price. Born Paul Williams in Philadelphia in 1934, Billy grew up surrounded by rhythm and smoke. By age 11, he was performing with jazz legends like Ella Fitzgerald and Dinah Washington, not a boy chasing fame, but a prodigy learning the rules of seduction through song. Yet the golden age of jazz wasn't kind to every talent. For a young black man trying to rise in a segregated industry, the path to survival often bent toward compromise. The gigs came and went, the bills didn't. That's when the whispers began, not in the press, but in the after-hours lounges of Philadelphia's elite. They said Billy wasn't just singing for applause, he was singing privately for the city's high society women, the kind who wore pearls to midnight dinners and could buy silence as easily as champagne. These gatherings weren't sordid, they were sophisticated. No cameras, no contracts, no witnesses, only soft lights, red wine, and a man whose voice could turn loneliness into gold. A veteran Philly DJ once said, "Billy wasn't a hustler, he was an experience. He made people feel seen, and that's what they paid for." It wasn't about scandal, it was about survival. When talent got him in the room, charm helped him stay there. And for a struggling artist, sometimes that was enough to keep the dream alive. Those who knew him in those early years described a ritual. Billy would perform in smoky clubs until late, then vanish into the back of a sleek car that appeared like clockwork. No one knew where he went. By morning, he was back, smiling faintly, tired but content, as if he had carried someone's secret through the night. The irony, of course, is that the song that would define his career, "Me and Mrs. Jones," mirrored the rumors perfectly. A love that couldn't be public, a connection bound by secrecy. When Billy sang it, he didn't just perform, he confessed. Each note trembled with truth, the kind only a man who'd lived double lives could express. Fans began to wonder, was he telling someone else's story, or finally whispering his own? By the early 1970s, under the guidance of producers Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff, Billy Paul became a household name. He won a Grammy, earned respect across generations, and became a symbol of class and sophistication. Yet even at the height of his fame, he remained an enigma, articulate in music, silent in life. He never addressed the rumors. He didn't need to. His songs spoke for him, weaving together the ache of secrecy and the grace of restraint. In his later years, Billy shifted toward activism and introspection. He sang of justice and dignity, of the cost of being both brilliant and black in an unforgiving world. But beneath his political fire still lingered the emotional depth of a man who had once sold intimacy not as a sin, but as a strategy. Billy Paul passed away in 2016, leaving behind a legacy of velvet-smooth honesty. Whether or not the whispers were true no longer matters. What endures is the truth beneath his music, that every note came from a man who had lived in both the light and the shadows, who understood that love, art, and survival sometimes share the same breath. He didn't just sing Me and Mrs. Jones, he embodied it. A secret affair between art and experience. A melody born from silence, longing, and the price of being unforgettable. 5. Marvin Gaye. Before Marvin Gaye became the sensual voice behind sexual healing and the spiritual protest of what's going on, he was just a young man alone in Los Angeles, burdened by debt, disappointment, and the painful weight of dreams deferred. After his initial break with Harvey Fuqua and the Moonglows faded, and before Motown opened its gates, Marvin wasn't a superstar. He was a struggling singer with no money and no connections in a city that cared little about his potential. He arrived in LA in the early 1960s, penniless and emotionally fractured, estranged from his strict father and haunted by self-doubt. Sources close to Marvin, including former bandmates and studio engineers, have whispered for decades about a period where he allegedly engaged in transactional relationships with older men and women to make ends meet. These weren't relationships built on romance or even music industry networking. They were silent exchanges arranged behind closed doors, negotiated in whispers, and carried out under the weight of necessity. A former friend once claimed Marvin would show up at luxury apartments, looking like a jazz ballad, dressed in second-hand suits, his hands slightly trembling, but always polite. The guests were often much older, affluent, and eager for his presence. Not always sexual, these encounters were more about intimacy for hire, a few hours of companionship, conversation, and comfort, bought and sold like a service. Do you think society forces young artists to make impossible choices when fame feels out of reach? Marvin never spoke openly about these alleged encounters, perhaps because he feared judgment, or because it was easier to turn trauma into song than into confession. In the 1970s, as his fame blossomed, his lyrics began to reflect not just desire but longing, an aching quality that hinted at something deeper than love. Tracks like Distant Lover and Soon, I'll Be Loving You Again carried a mixture of seduction and sorrow, as though he were trying to reclaim a part of himself that had been given away too many times. Despite his incredible success, Grammy Awards, platinum albums, sold-out tours, Marvin never seemed to outrun that earlier pain. Friends described him as deeply spiritual yet perpetually unsettled, often retreating into isolation. He had a pattern of falling into tumultuous relationships, self-sabotaging career moves, and eventually drug abuse. These behaviors weren't just rock star cliches. They were symptoms of a man grappling with the emotional residue of having once commodified his own affection to survive. In David Ritz's authorized biography Divided Soul, Marvin once cryptically admitted, "There were things I did, things no one should have to do to eat." He left it there. He didn't elaborate, but for those who had heard the rumors, the statement felt like a confirmation wrapped in careful words. Perhaps most tragic is how Marvin's past mirrored the themes of his most powerful work. Inner City Blues, Make Me Wanna Holler isn't just about economic struggle, it's about the trauma of being seen as a body before being seen as a soul. That duality, between godlike talent and human vulnerability, defined Marvin Gaye's life. He died at 44, shot by his own father just a day before his birthday. The world mourned the loss of a musical prophet, but beneath the tributes and retrospectives, the unspoken truth remained. Marvin Gaye was not just a man shaped by music, he was shaped by survival. Every note he sang was layered with memories of things no young man should have had to do just to stay afloat. In the end, Marvin's greatness wasn't only in his voice, but in his ability to transform private pain into public poetry. His legend is untouchable, but his journey was far from clean. And maybe that's what makes him so enduring. Not perfection, but resilience in the face of hidden scars. 6. Billy Preston. Before the world crowned him, the fifth Beatle, Billy Preston had already lived through shadows most never saw. On stage, he shone like sunlight. That infectious grin, the rhythmic sway, his fingers gliding over the Hammond keys, as if the music itself bowed to him. Yet long before the roaring crowds and Grammy Awards, there was a young black man in 1950s Los Angeles, fighting rent deadlines, chasing gigs, and learning how survival sometimes demanded more than talent. Born in Houston in 1946 and raised in South Central LA, Billy was a child prodigy who seemed destined for greatness. By 10, he was playing organ for Mahalia Jackson. By his teens, he had met Nat King Cole and Ray Charles. But for all his brilliance, opportunity rarely knocked twice for young black musicians in that segregated era. Club owners underpaid, managers disappeared, and the city's glitter hid deep inequities. Somewhere in that uncertainty, stories began to circulate, quiet, persistent, never proven. Friends from his youth whispered that Billy sometimes accepted private engagements from wealthy patrons, not concert halls, but quiet rooms with pianos, wine, and conversation. He was paid not just for melodies but for presence, for the gift of making others feel seen, special, and less alone. One acquaintance once said, "Billy didn't just play songs, he played people's hearts." The line, meant as praise, later echoed with ambiguity. There were no photos, no contracts, Just glances exchanged across tables and envelopes passed discreetly. In LA's show business underbelly, such arrangements weren't unusual, especially for artists trying to survive between gigs. If fame was the dream, then charm was often the currency that paid for the journey. And Billy, with his disarming smile and soulful calm, understood how to use both. When My Sweet Lord and Get Back Later echoed across the world, that difficult past faded under spotlights. Billy's collaborations with the Beatles, Aretha Franklin, and the Rolling Stones turned him into a living bridge between gospel and rock, sanctified fire and playful funk. But those who'd known him in his youth sometimes wondered whether that eternal smile was learned, perfected during the years when he had to please others just to stay afloat. It wasn't judgment, it was empathy, because behind every bright stage, there are alleys no one talks about. Billy's story reminded people that even the icons of joy often walked through quiet nights of compromise before the morning applause arrived. As his fame grew, so did the contradictions within him. He was a devout Christian who wrestled with guilt, identity, and loneliness. His faith gave him strength, yet it also magnified his inner conflict between what he believed and what he had done to survive. Friends described him as radiant in company, but melancholy in solitude. Over time, the laughter gave way to silence, and the silence to pain. Through the 1970s, hits like Nothing from Nothing and Will It Go Round in Circles carried an irresistible energy, joyful, funky, alive. But listen closely, and beneath the joy lies yearning, a man trying to convince himself that light can erase the past. Behind every exuberant note was a history of whispered transactions, silent prayers, and the heavy price of endurance. In later decades, Billy faced demons that fame couldn't cure: addiction, depression, and scandal. His legal troubles in the 1990s and 2000s painted a painful portrait of a man whose faith and frailty were forever intertwined. Yet even through the turbulence, his genius never dimmed. Musicians across generations still called him the heartbeat of the organ, a spirit who turned pain into rhythm. Billy Preston died in 2006 at 59, leaving behind music that shimmered with both light and lament. The rumors of his early life remain unconfirmed, unresolved, unforgettable, but perhaps that's fitting, because Billy's legacy was never about perfection. It was about humanity, flawed, luminous, and deeply felt. Listen closely to that Hammond swell in My Sweet Lord, or that playful riff in Outta Space, and you'll hear not just skill but confession. The echo of a boy who once walked through secret rooms, dreaming of a future where he could finally play for himself and be free. 7. Fillmore Slim. Fillmore Slim never apologized for who he was. While others spent their lives running from the shadows of their past, he walked straight through them, sharp suit pressed, hat tilted low, eyes full of stories no book could ever tell. They called him the West Coast Godfather of the game, and he wore that title like a badge of honor, not shame. Because for Slim, the game wasn't just about hustling, it was survival, style, and ultimately art. Born Clarence Sims in Baton Rouge in 1934, Slim's journey was carved from equal parts grit and grace. He grew up chasing melodies and streetlights, learning early that talent alone couldn't pay rent. By the time he settled in San Francisco's Fillmore district, the neighborhood had become a crucible of rhythm and rebellion, where jazz mixed with commerce, and survival often required a double life. Slim fit perfectly into both worlds. By day, he played his guitar and charmed audiences in smoky clubs. By night, he managed a network of companions, mastering the art of conversation, persuasion, and power. Unlike other legends whose scandals were whispered behind closed doors, Fillmore Slim told his story himself. He never disguised his past as rumor. He turned it into rhythm. "Music and the streets were my two loves," he once said. A line that could have been a blues lyric if it weren't already his truth. The honesty disarmed people. It made his music believable, his persona magnetic. When he sang about struggle, longing, or temptation, listeners could feel the asphalt under his words, the pulse of neon, the smell of sweat and ambition. In the Fillmore district of the 1960s and 70s, Slim was both performer and participant, an architect of two overlapping worlds. He played bars until dawn, then disappeared into back rooms where no one needed contracts to understand what was being exchanged. But even there, he was learning. "The streets taught me timing," he said, "when to talk, when to listen, and when to play." That instinct later became his signature as a musician. He read crowds like he once read clients, knowing exactly how to make them lean in, laugh, and believe. Slim didn't glamorize his past or wallow in regret. He transformed it. His songs, The Game, Style, and Grace, Hey Little Brother, were less confessions than reflections, snapshots of a man who understood the poetry and contradiction. Where others used metaphor, Slim used memory. Every guitar riff carried both swagger and sorrow, a reminder that beauty can grow out of broken ground. By the late 1990s, younger generations rediscovered him. Hip-hop icons like Snoop Dogg and Too Short began name-dropping Fillmore Slim as one of the pioneers who turned the language of the streets into an art form. Suddenly, the man once dismissed as a hustler was being celebrated as a storyteller, someone who had lived the realities others only rapped about. His name started appearing in documentaries and retrospectives, bridging eras and genres, a living connection between blues authenticity and hip-hop realism. Even into his 80s, Slim performed with undiminished flair, wide-brimmed hat, sharp suit, and that sly smile that said he'd seen it all and lived to tell it. He never sanitized his story for comfort or commerce. Instead, he invited the world to look straight at it. The hustles, the heartbreaks, the triumph of self-invention. Now in his 90s, Fillmore Slim stands as one of the last living testaments to a vanishing era, when music wasn't just performance but survival, when confession wasn't weakness but art. His life reminds us that greatness doesn't always rise from purity. Sometimes it's born from the grit beneath neon lights, from the courage to claim your scars and turn them into sound. Fillmore Slim didn't just play the blues, he was the blues, raw, unapologetic, and everlasting. These stories, whether whispered rumors or memories shared by those who lived through them, reveal a hidden side of these legendary Black R&B artists, men and women who poured their souls into music while fighting to survive in a world that didn't always play fair. They came from narrow streets, humble homes, and tiny recording studios filled with hope and desperation. Some walked difficult paths, made painful choices, and carried secrets we may never fully understand. Yet, that is what makes their journeys so profoundly human. Behind every spotlight was struggle. Behind every melody was a story of sacrifice, courage, and the cost of chasing a dream that sometimes demanded too much. These tales remind us that fame is never just glory, it's also pain, perseverance, and the price of staying true to one's gift. If these untold stories touched your heart, please give this video a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and hit subscribe.